So welcome again to September's IEU Learning Talk. These events are convened by the Independent Evaluation Unit to foster dialogue and debate within the Green Climate Fund and to make sure that the fund remains a learning institution. And today we're thrilled to convene this talk alongside close colleagues from the Division for Adaptation and Mitigation, and we'll be focusing on the findings and results from the IEU's LORTA program, that's Learning Orientated Real-Time Impact Assessment program, which embeds impact evaluation methodologies within GCF projects. The structure of today's roundtable is that we'll hand over initially to our close colleague, Dr. Anastasia Aladisheva, Impact Evaluation Specialist ad interim in the IEU, and then we'll swiftly move on to a panel conversation between two colleagues from DMA and close colleagues from the Independent Evaluation Unit. So we welcome Joseph Inseful, Senior Climate Information and Early Warning System Specialist from DMA, and Gabrielle Bock, Senior Agriculture and Food Security Specialist, alongside our close colleague Susumu Yoshida. And we'll conduct a panel conversation for 25 minutes or so before turning to Q&A from the audience. And we're thrilled that we've got so many colleagues sitting around the table on the 12th floor, and also a large number of colleagues have joined online, and we'll be canvassing your opinions and asking you to engage in the conversation about how the results from impact evaluations can be better integrated within programming and the review process within DMA, and how they can better support the effectiveness and efficiency of the fund alongside monitoring work. So without any further ado, we'll hand over to Anna to kick off the presentation, and then we'll turn to the panel conversation across Gabrielle, Joseph, Susumu, Anna, and I, before turning to broader Q&A from the floor and also online. So over to you, Anna.
Hello, thank you very much, Martin, for this introduction, and thank you very much for coming and joining us at the boardroom, but also for joining us virtually. As you know, in the Independent Evaluation Unit, we have our LORTA program, and where we provide capacity building in a specific type of evaluations called impact evaluations. And there are a few questions that always arise, not only within the GCF, IEU, GCF ecosystem, but also more broadly. So one of the questions is, what is the impact of GCF investments on people's well-being and resilience to climate change? The second question is, what are the key mechanisms that drive this change? And a third question, how can this inform GCF programming and policies? This is kind of a long, kind of lasting question. How do we bridge evidence that we create and policy slash project design and project implementation? So in LORTA, we completed one impact evaluation last year of FP002, is one of the early projects funded by GCF in Malawi. And this year we are about to complete another impact evaluation of FP069 in Bangladesh. So these two projects have one common feature. It's the early warning system intervention. But the project in Bangladesh has a specific focus, has a specific gender focus. So we, in impact evaluations, we do not do an evaluation of the whole project, because the projects usually funded by GCF have several components. They have a capacity building or policy component, and they also have other components. So in LORTA, we focus on more something that we could measure, something which is targeted on beneficiaries, something which is more tangible. So for impact evaluation of P069, we focus on two components. First one is the climate resilient livelihood support. This specific component is 100% targeting women. The second component is drinking water solutions, which is 50% women, 50% male population in the two regions, coastal regions in Bangladesh prone to climate change risks. And what are the key results of the impact evaluation? First one, we found, so we collect baseline and endline data and analyzed it, and what we found is that there's an increase in women's engagement and income generating activities, which was a specific focus of the project, and as a result, income in the last 12 months. We also found increased food security by 8%, which we measured by the food consumption score. And we also found the increased perceptions of the household preparedness against future weather events. With the impact evaluation in Malawi, we focus on a component called PIXA. This is a participatory decision-making training on agricultural adaptation for the farmers. So basically, the farmers were given weather and climate historical information and forecasts. They were given inputs, and they were also provided this PIXA training. And what were the key results of this impact evaluation? We found positive impacts on agricultural adaptation. The farmers said that they use seasonal forecasts for crop activity. We also found impacts on self-reported maize yields. We also found a decrease in some sort of a poverty, kind of a poverty proxy, a poverty indicator. This is called Ganyo labor, where majority of many females are involved in where they work on other people's farms. So we saw the decrease in that, but we didn't find significant impacts on livestock adaptation or food security. So with this, it might be the measurement issue, or it can be that the project didn't have the significant impact on these two indicators. So I'm handing over also to Martin to present midterm results from the project in Madagascar.
Thank you ever so much, Anna. Yes, so we've just completed the midline evaluation of the Sustainable Landscapes in Eastern Madagascar, SLEM project, which focuses on 23,800 households within the eastern corridor of rainforest in Madagascar. And the two components that we are conducting the impact evaluation on are improvements in climate change resilience and in food security through the adoption of climate resilient agricultural practices, and forest protection and restoration. So to reiterate, these are midline results. We'll conduct an endline survey in the near future. And the design for these findings was a phase-in randomized design. So community groups receive the intervention in a phased-in manner, which fits with project implementation. And the phase-in was randomized, so we compared the adoption and intermediate outcomes between those that received the set of adaptation and mitigation interventions earlier within the project cycle compared to those who are receiving the project interventions later. And what we found was widespread adoption of conservation agricultural practices between 2 to 20% percentage points increase across a whole range of climate resilient agricultural practices. We found improvements in food security status using the WFP's consolidated reporting of indicators for food security, and we found fewer households who had received the intervention conducting unsustainable activities. Interestingly, when we turn to gender, to follow up with your emphasis there, Anna, and we found women differential adoption of climate resilient agriculture practices, with women-headed households adopting particular intervention types, soil conservation practices and terracing, and households headed by men driving adoption of a different set of climate resilient agriculture practices, drought resistant crops, off-season rice, pest management practices, and savings groups. And so I'll hand back to you, Anna, to move on.
Thank you very much, Martin. So, of course, in LORTA, this is our first impact evaluation midterm result, and we also we have a lot of projects in the baseline stage. Impact evaluation sometimes can take several years. But the idea also for today to have a kind of roundtable discussion and live conversation, And I prepared this kind of slides on the steps. This is just a very generic steps of how do we actually bridge evidence and policy, I think, or policy or project implementation. And I think many international organizations and academics and other actors, ask this question. And in LORTA, we generate a lot of, we generate evidence, and we are planning to generate more evidence, and hopefully to inform GCF work. So yeah, I think it's over from my end. So over to you, Martin.
Thank you, Anna. And so to kick off the discussion of the roundtable, I'll just hand briefly over to our close colleague Susumu, who leads the LORTA program within the Independent Evaluation Unit. Just some reflections in terms of those findings, and then we'll hand over to, we'll start the discussion with Joseph and Gabrielle. Over to you, Susumu.
Okay, thank you, Martin, and thank you for all the participants who are here today with us. So as you can imagine, as you know, measuring impact doesn't happen from today to tomorrow. It's a long process, right? So these three impact evaluation that Anna and Martin shared today, Bangladesh, we started working with them in 2019, I think, and then the Malawi and Madagascar since 2018. So it's been a long time that we have been working. So we have about 23 projects in LORTA program at the moment that we are working. It's about 10% of the GCF portfolio, right? So what we want to know, like personally, I want to know today, and from the discussion is, when is really a good time for us to start engaging with the project? Because we want to make sure that the evidence that we generate is going to be used for the design of the new project, and any learning that which can be generated can be useful for informing the new project. But sometimes we miss this critical moment. It cannot be too early. It cannot be too late, because then the option is going to be limited when we design the impact evaluations. So I'm happy to hear more from you guys as well, and then learn from you guys today. Thank you.
Thank you, Susumu. So we can hand initially over to Joseph, just to hear how we can better close this learning loop and integrate these findings within GCF programming. Handing over to you first, Joseph.
Arthur, thank you very much. Warm greetings from Nairobi. I'm very much excited to really share with you some of the key elements that I think is relevant in closing the loop. I think is very, very critical that we look at the way we design projects in terms of looking at the co-design and co-implementation as a process where we will enable ownership and uptake of interventions and the results. If a project is designed without engagement, active engagement of the users, the needs of the recipient and other elements well articulated, then definitely we will find a challenge with uptake, and also implementation will become a very serious challenge. I think also one of the elements that is very, very important in terms of how we will be able to translate action into impact is really to integrate also the leadership dimensions of the project design and also of its implementation, because leadership really shapes how some of these projects are designed and implemented on the ground. But more importantly, also the co-design and co-implementation concept also creates behavioral changes that could lead to lasting impacts beyond the life cycle of the project. So I think these are the core elements that needs to be really, really integrated into how a project is designed and implemented to enable us to get lasting and impactful results.
Thank you, Joseph, for those initial contributions. And then we hand over to Gabrielle now for further reflections. Gabrielle.
Thank you. And I'll try to bring it a bit more practical, referring to one of the projects that we're including in your LORTA evaluations, the FP002 in Malawi. That's, as the number says, 002, one of the earliest GCF projects. And I think it was particularly useful to do an impact evaluation of this one, given the fact that will increase the programming in early warning systems in GCF2. And we need to learn from this first wave of early warning systems how we can ensure that the last mile of impact is actually achieved. Because it's very interesting to look at the last APR publicly available for that project that's now completed, to listen to the results of the LORTA evaluation. And then we had the opportunity to actually be in Malawi in February this year as part of a country programming commission. And it's a bit like putting together a puzzle of findings, because you have an APR that's telling us that over 1 million beneficiaries have benefited from this project. You're having a LORTA evaluation that's giving some positive outcomes in terms of adaptation, but no significant results yet on actual food security and other, let's say, end results and impacts that we want to see in our beneficiaries. And then you go and you talk with the accredited entity in the country, and you randomly meet a group of potential beneficiaries, and they report that they don't have access to the information. So I think what's coming in this particular example of FP002 clear is that the approach that's being proposed in the project is one that delivers results, but deliver results to a rather limited number of people. And in this particular approach, there are what they call lead farmers that have clear access to the training and the information. And at that point in time where they received it, it really made an impact on their agricultural activities and their livelihoods. But then this type of conversations trigger the question, will that impact last? What happens when the project ends? How are they going to continue to get access to early warning systems? And how can we do better in the future wave of programming of projects? Also triggers the question, a small subset of the reported beneficiaries have benefited and have clear significant impact recorded. What about the rest of them? And this type of conversations that we're having here, and also the access that we have increasingly as DMA specialists and task managers to the findings of the independent evaluation unit, really help us in trying to choose between different alternatives when we design projects, but also make hard choices sometimes between having fewer beneficiaries, but with a clear demonstrable impact, versus having a bigger outreach, but maybe with a thinner layer of support. I'll stop there for the beginning.
Thank you very much. Very rich contributions there from Joseph and Gabriel. Anna, I wondered if you wanted to reflect a bit on the subgroups, impacts on different subgroups. So over to you, Anna.
Thank you very much, Gabriel, for that. I must say that impact evaluation of P002, if I can say like that, is our first baby, with some issues with the data that we had, but especially the baseline data that we collected back in 2018, right? So we, unfortunately, we were limited to the impact evaluation on the lead farmers only. So we cannot exactly maybe say whether we can extrapolate or whether the results are valid for the contact farmers or the other categories of farmers. So that's one thing which I wanted to say. Another thing, you asked the question, will the impact last? And we don't know. I don't think we have an answer from the LORTA perspective on this question, because we don't have an opportunity to collect data after the project finishes. Yeah. So
maybe I can jump in that, because so we did a LORTA design capacity building workshop last week. So we invited 5 AEs, which are not with LORTA yet, but they are still early stage of project implementation. So we are seeking potential to see what can be evaluated in each project. So we did it last week here in Sondo. So that question we received from one of the participants, how do we make sure that the impact or the project is going to be sustained, or can we measure across or beyond the project cycle? Yes, that's of course the interest of everybody, right? But unfortunately, the internal process, project cycle, and the budget doesn't align with that interest. So that's why we are here, because we don't necessarily work with the project. So our program continues, But again, still, it's a matter of budget implication as well, which we don't have because we cannot provide data collection support. But at least we can guide that we put ground infrastructure, like putting the right data point for each project or within the country. So we helped building the right M&E systems and then the different kind of data that can be used not only for impact evaluation purpose, but to help the project management purpose as well. So I think that's the kind of like the way how we work with the project teams, not just for evaluation purpose, not for the publication purposes, but to make sure that the project management that happen, which I think in the case of GCF, it is a little bit difficult to see because it's done by AEs, not done by us, right? So maybe I want to add that.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, maybe I can add another angle to this discussion. I've had the opportunity to work in Malawi, one of my previous jobs where I supported a lot of work on the ground. And also the FP002 is beyond farming. It looks at critical sectors of the economy, particularly if you look at the areas within on Lake Malawi, where lightning is a significant risk to the population. And so I think if you look at the broader scope of the project, you'll find that this project is very, very impactful in terms of what it aims to achieve. Also, if you unpack a bit, you look at the critical sectors of water resources and health and security, human well-being. You realize that the key elements in particular that one needs to look at goes beyond just agricultural sector. And I think we need to look at it within the context of how the project will impact beyond a given sector. I look at this as being cross-cutting, being multi-sectorial in terms of the impact that it will have. So it will be important to look at this holistically than just taking agriculture, because you in effect will lose some of the core benefits that are critical to properly assess the impact that this project will provide to the sustainable development of the communities.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Joseph. It's a great contribution because often the impact evaluations just focus on a single component. We don't look at the impact of all of the combined impact of all of the components of a project. So that point's really valid, and if we can overcome that, that would definitely enhance our impact estimates and also programming. I'd like to hand over to Gabriel now, just to further reflect on those topics. Gabriel.
Yeah, no, and I fully agree with Joseph. I think in the end, early warning systems are a tool in support of many sectors and the resilience of people whose lives depend on many sectors. In the particular context of FP002, I think what the accredited entity put forward in the package and what was implemented on the ground was heavily focused on the agricultural sector. But in the end, what has been set up in terms of infrastructure, in terms of systems, instead of training the public sector capacity to use early warning system, is valuable beyond one sector. And it's incredibly valuable for the country. But I always joke that we can't, or the beneficiaries can't eat early warning systems, or they can't make a livelihoods and income out of early warning systems. So the question I always try to ask when I review processes and I co-originate with different accredited entities is, there will be impact delivered throughout the project duration. That's clear. I think most of our entities know how to do that. What we don't know yet for sure, at least in the portfolio that I have, is like, how do we make sure it continues after the end of the project? How do we make sure that the information gets delivered, that decisions can be made on that information, that people can take preventive action or adaptive action using that type of information? And at the moment of February this year, when we're in Malawi, that question was still lingering because it was not fully embedded in the project design. The accredited entity hasn't yet found a solution, and I think we also haven't pushed sufficiently hard on that question. So what the impact evaluations from your side provides is a good snapshot of what has been achieved up to a certain point. We don't know moving forward. It's not your role as the independent evaluation unit to look forward and try to guess what might happen. In a way, the burden of proof is on us in our next wave of projects that will be programming and originating to reflect on the lessons learned and try to raise a bit the burden of sustainability and exit strategy that these projects have as we go forward.
Thank you. So we can pick up on that a bit more, Gabriel, perhaps, and ask, now, how can DMA colleagues, especially during the project review process, be better informed by IEU-LORTA findings? What channels can this happen? How can the project review process integrate these findings more systematically? And I mean, this is about closing that learning loop. How can that happen on a more institutional basis as opposed to an ad hoc basis?
I wish I could deflect this to Joseph, but
Okay.
but no.
Okay. Yeah, I can pick this up. I think I fully agree with Gabriel on the observations he made. I think very clearly we also need to look at how our projects are impacting or changing behaviors. Behavioral change is so important for sustainability. If we can build a culture of sustainability through the implementation of our projects, if we can build a behavioral change in terms of taking responsibility for the investment that we make in the countries, I think this will go beyond the life cycle of the projects and something that we haven't really looked into in terms of the social and behavioral impact that our interventions are making. But then I will, coming back to the question, in terms of what we look for in terms of the project review process and the like, we draw evidence from a number of sources. I mean, we undertake pre-feasibility assessment. Sometimes there's review. We build evidence from the ground. We conduct a more integrated and comprehensive approach that adopts ways of assessing the causal relationships and feedback. This is done through the lens of our investment criteria and policies. We, in particular, will look at the impact potential, not just in terms of monetary terms, in terms of $1 spent per person, but also look at the social, economic, and environmental co-benefits that could be derived from those interventions. We'll also look at the paradigm shifting potential in terms of the innovation that it brings, both in terms of behavioral change, technological advancement, and the like. And then we'll look at the critical elements and the context in which the project is designed. So this needs to be done in a very, very comprehensive and integrated way. Basically, we will also look at certain lessons and best practices that could be scaled up. It is important really to build on what has already been done, identifying the gaps that need to be scaled up, and finding innovative ways of ensuring that those designs are co-developed and co-implemented on the ground. And I think I want to come back to and re-emphasize on the fact that behavioral change is what will create the sustainability that we look for. But of course, we draw also from the authoritative institutions like the WMO when it comes to early warning systems. The WMO has the standards, well-established standards that we need to adhere to. We look at some kind of community of practice where we draw some of the ideas, particularly the IPCC assessment report, and specific thematic sector assessments and knowledge that has been accrued within the community. And so we use all of these together to find the best possible configuration of the project that could be designed and implemented on the ground. So these are critical elements that we do. First, looking at the evidence-based from the ground. And then we also do some kind of system assessments, looking at the dynamics, how things will change, in particular policy, how technology influences some of the options that are available, and as well as the human elements that I think is very, very important and area that we need to focus on in project design and evaluation. Over.
Can I jump on that?
Yeah, please
Martin?
do, yes.
So I'm glad to hear that you guys are already incorporating some evidence when the AEs develops proposals. But I'd like to ask, how much as you guys are specialists in the topic or sector, I'd like to hear like how much that you guys can like review these aspect when you see in the proposals, not just copy and paste from the other project document that they have for the co-financing or the other projects.
Yeah, if I may come in again, I think intelligence is very, very important. One of the things I do personally is that I have a personal relationship with the accredited entities. I get my hands dirty with them to probe a bit into verifying what has been submitted to us. Sometimes I have to bring ideas to them. Sometimes they are limited in terms of the scope and scale which they need to look to. So I draw evidence from what is well established, particularly in the area of climate information and early warning systems. We have indigenous knowledge, which is critical. I mean, adaptation is local, the weather is local. I mean, you cannot just port systems from other places and place it in a local context. It just doesn't work. And my experience, I think, has validated this concept. I remember in some of the early years, I worked with IGAD. We did some projects in the Litotok region with the Maasai, where they have their own indigenous ways of forecasting. And so we have this consensus forecast, bringing the scientific forecast together with indigenous knowledge and try to come up with a consensus. And I must say that sometimes they have better forecasts than we do. And the lessons that I've learned from this experience is that it really shows confidence. For somebody to accept a forecast is very, very difficult for the local people because it's tied to their belief system. You cannot just provide a forecast and then assume that people will use it. The uptake doesn't happen that way. You need to have personal relationship with them and work with them to co-create. So I think this experience will be very, very rich in bringing in some of the lessons that have been learned in engaging, working with accredited entities and other partners to really strengthen the elements of the project design. And of course, when there are limitations in terms of what the accredited entities propose, we also go beyond and bring in other partners that we think can make things work. I can give an example from the Athi River project that we approved for Kenya. They had a lot of challenges in terms of addressing some aspects of the project. And I have to use my personal network to call the group in APAC, some of the best climate scientists that we have on the continent, who came in and shaped the project. They really redesigned the project in a way that was paradigm shifting. And ITAP was even shocked to find that such capabilities exist in Kenya, and they could not use it initially to address the problem. So these are some of the elements that we pull together when designing projects. And I think experience also matters. Having a knowledge of what happens on the ground, being closer to them, enables us to really reduce some of the risk that will come up, particularly when the project is approved and is under implementation. And so I think these are lessons that we are learning, that engagement matters, belief systems matter when you are doing local adaptation, in particular systems that goes beyond just the science, but also the social, cultural, political, and belief system of the communities that we serve.
Thank you, Joseph. I just want to bring Anna in quickly, just for a further reflection, and then hand to Gabrielle, just perhaps on scaling up and paradigm shift. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Joseph. I just want to reflect on the thing that you said about the theory of change, if I understood correctly, and trying to embed kind of sustainability into the theory of change. So I just want to mention that in LORTA, we reviewed, right, for some of the theory of change in the proposal. We're trying to unpack those theories of change from the impact evaluation perspective, focusing more and targeting more on the beneficiaries and on the people. Sometimes what we see in the funding proposals is that, okay, the main impact or the main goal is building resilience, reducing CO2 emissions and building resilience. So we're trying to understand, okay, what does it mean? specifically for this context, for this specific intervention, whether it's a water intervention, agriculture, or whatever that component we're focusing on. So I just wanted to reflect on that because it triggered my thinking. I think it's a very complex task to embed sustainability, but I think it's very important. I agree with you. But also I would like to mention that there's so many factors, as we see at the moment, there's so many factors that can break that theory of chain to sustainability. We saw that with COVID. So I just wanted to reflect and to say that it's a quite of an ambitious task for all of us.
Thank you, Anna. That's great. And hand over to Gabrielle on scaling up and paradigm shift, and then we'll open up for questions from the floor. So looking forward to lots of engagement from the 28 or so colleagues we have in the room here and also colleagues online. Over to you, Gabrielle.
Thank you, Martin. I think we have a very big task ahead of us for GCF2, both in terms of volume of programming that we need to do, but also improving the quality of the programming, both in terms of the quality at entry of projects and the speed and the quality of the implementation that follows afterwards. So I think this whole discussion we're having here and broader at the level of the institution in terms of lessons learned and learning loops, I think is extremely important. What we need to do is systematize a bit using what you are producing as knowledge. And that should probably start with the simplest possible, spoon feeding us your impact evaluations when they're ready. So when there's one ready for a specific sector, country, and entity, everyone who is a task manager working on that entity, that country, and that sector should get it in our inbox. We should also then try to work more with the accredited entities to have these learning loops with the accredited entities as well, not just us, because the burden should not only be on us. We have entities bringing to us similar projects in different geographies without demonstrating that they've learned something from the first development, appraisal, and approval process, nor from implementation. So increasingly also our concept note templates, already complicated as they are, should also include a question or a tab, small one, in which the entity should report on how they're applying lessons learned from their own portfolio on that topic, from implementation in that particular country, and you make a reference to what you're producing. And that will, I think, help create more of a culture of let's not repeat the same mistake twice. Let's try to think more innovative. Let's try to pick up the solutions, interventions that work, and let's try to make the hard choices between competing objectives that we have in programs.
Fantastic. Thank you, Gabrielle. Some really concrete suggestions there about how we can increase the uptake of these findings. So we're going to open up to the floor for questions, first of all, in the boardroom and then online. And we've got a couple of colleagues that have indicated they want to come in. So I'm going to first turn to Johan. I'm from DMA and then back on. And yeah, Johan.
Yeah, good afternoon. Yeah, I think I also should help out my colleagues because it is my role to ensure the learning loop and promote the learning loop. And I can assure you that the DMA management is also considers it very urgent and important to do that. So that's, we need to find ways. I think everyone has to have some mind space and time to look at the documents, evaluation documents, and digest it. We might be able to make that easier and from our perspective, extract the nuggets that are important for different colleagues so they don't need to go through everything and have discussion on that. About the issues on sustainability, they're actually quite close to my heart because I worked on governance and capacity building and sustainability. So in fact, I think it's in GCF's interest to think about the governance and sustainability early on, because it does not only come at the end of the project, it comes already in the design, and then even the speeding up the route to effectiveness. These problems often already emerge because if the institutionalization and sustainability is not ensured, then maybe the countries will expect it to go in a different way. So in many projects, in fact, there's the institutionalization and sustainability is part of the M&E framework, which means you have separate measurement on that, and also either an integrated work stream or it is a separate component, but either way can be done. So I think that needs to be considered, as it could also make life a lot easier to get to the implementation stage and then to the successful implementation. I also would like to raise one thing that could be an opportunity. I'm wondering, these 3 projects all have been quite successful. The outcomes are quite convincing. And is there been any talk about extending them and have a phase 2 or replicating them? Because that would align with the ambition of GCF to grow and to build on our relationships with accredited agencies. And in my experience, the impact and sustained impact comes only after 6 to 8 years. And 3 or 4 year project is typically not enough in a developing country to get to that stage of institutionalization and securing that the impact is achieved. So those considerations. Maybe the one last consideration is to ensure that the learning loop goes into what we just discussed in the previous meeting is risk identification, because there's a strong initiative in the GCF to strengthen risk management. And one of the key risks is not achieving the impact or the desired outcomes. And that could be informed very strongly with IEU products. Thank you.
Thank you, Johan. So I'd like to invite panel members to respond to those, and then we'll turn to Bapon and then Priksha in the chat. Any instant reflections on Johan's contribution? So Joseph, I see you're warming up over there.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I fully agree with him. Like I earlier on said that sustainability should be part of behavioral change. It has to be a culture, to enable projects to go beyond the life cycle. Once it becomes a culture, it impacts on the behavior. Then it could be scaled up to other projects that are not even GCF commitments. And I think that identifying this from the onset, developing a stronger risk identification framework, and also integrating this in an M&E system will be very, very important. We need metrics to measure them in real time, and also be able to really adjust, maybe during midterm review, to ensure that the project is online in terms of achieving its strategic goals. I think these are elements that needs to be really, really integrated into the way we measure impacts, and then the alignment of the strategic goals needs to be needs to be consistently monitored to ensure that the project delivers beyond the life cycle of the projects.
Thank you, Joseph. Over to Susumu.
Yeah, so I was in China in May this year at the UN Data Summit. So I was in the panel with the Malawi team from UNDP Malawi and their counterpart in the government. So the government official was saying that they were discussing our finding internally, and they got quite excited. So they are trying to use the whatever we did to try to use it. So I think that's a great to hear, of course, from our perspective. I'm not sure what's happened next, but as Joseph said, we are here to build culture of using this evidence, and then and it takes time, but that's we want to see it. So I'm quite happy to see that, and we try to do more and more, right? So that's I think what we are trying to do here.
Thank you, Susumu. So before handing over to Priksha for her comment and question, over to Bapon quickly from the floor. Bapon.
Thank you so much, Martin. And first of all, thank you so much for showing two good projects actually, and also quite a wonder actually to see actually has been actually you did a quantitative assessment to come up with a percentage of number that has been increased. And also, I fully agree with the two colleagues that actually the lessons that we learned from the beginning of the project for early warning systems, how we actually changed the culture a little bit on risk-informed decision-making, not only for one sector, but also for whole wider sector, because early warning is not only for agriculture or food security, it actually applicable for any single sector. And I think that's what the GCF is trying to promote at this particular time. Saying so, obviously in the GCF, we look at our project into 6 investment criteria, right? And then probably that's our baseline while we actually develop our proposal. I'm just trying to understand actually your evaluation result versus in terms of our investment criteria, how you actually measure that from the baseline to the result. And then obviously probably the result probably based on your survey or some cohort number, because it's more quantitative. What kind of distribution actually you use to come up with that kind of result on a specific result like 8%? Because there is so, and also in terms of a project when we actually implement, except for Bangladesh one, because I'm originally from Bangladesh. So while you're actually implementing a GCF project, at the same time, there are actually multiple programs is going on that enhancing the early warning system, then enhancing the food security, as well as women empowerment and others. So how you actually address that as a leverage or removing that biasness from our project to really measuring the impact that the number you found? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prapul. I can respond quickly just on the investment framework point and then hand over to colleagues on the wider points raised. So we've got the 3 investment criteria that are really key within the integrated results management framework. So impact potential, of course, we've got sustainable development potential, and we've got paradigm shift potential. So these types of findings clearly feed, as Joseph rightly highlighted, really feed into the impact potential scoring within the scorecard for investment criteria, and partially in terms of sustainable development potential. But where they're falling down in a sense is paradigm shift potential. And we'll come to that a bit later in the discussion about how we can scale up and really how we can integrate programming to ensure early warning for all, or to close the last mile in climate resilient agriculture interventions. But just in terms of the quantitative questions you asked, I'd like to hand over perhaps to my colleagues Susumu or Anna to respond. If not, I can take it as well.
Thank you for your questions. So we usually we try to use mixed methods, so quantitative and qualitative, but it's not always possible to have focus group discussion. So but quantitative is a kind of backbone of an impact evaluation. And we collect baseline data and endline data, and sometimes midline data, like in Madagascar. Not always baseline data is possible to collect because, let's say, the project intervention already started, for example. So we only rely on endline data, and with using some rigorous methodologies from the impact evaluation that we could estimate the impact. But your question on parallel projects. So the good thing about impact evaluation, so it's we focus on attribution rather than contribution. So I don't want to go too deep into technical details, but we have intervention group and we compare it with a control group, which usually comes either from the same district or from the neighboring district. And sometimes even, like in the case of Bangladesh, it receives the intervention at a later stage. So these 2 groups are exposed to the same interventions. So we statistically, we kind of eliminate this bias. Empirically, we estimate the impact, we call it a clean impact, so to speak, or unbiased, if I can say like that. I don't know if I answered your question, but
maybe I can answer slightly different angles. So when we design impact evaluation, we work with the specific evaluation question that we try to answer, right? It doesn't answer everything, but the focus that we think it's important for each project-specific context. So since we talked about early warning system a lot, I don't think anybody questions if early warning system is important or useful to help with the change their behavior, or like to inform the beneficiaries, right? But there are so many aspects that we can focus on. It's not a matter of impact of early warning system, but the question can be, how can we make it most, how can we maximize the investment, because there's so many things we don't know within the investment or infrastructure. Same for irrigation. We are not interested in the impact of irrigation, but often the issue is the operation issues, the maintenance issues. How can we solve these challenges in order to maximize this investment? So I think that's kind of like the angle that we try to see and try to maximize within the project context. And we can, of course, scale up whatever we find for that specific countries. So we do a data collection to answer that question. But again, as I said earlier, it's not just to inform that question, but try to synchronize whatever project needs to in terms of the midterm evaluations, the final evaluations, or the daily, or not daily, but the regular monitoring process, because the data is quite expensive if we try to collect. Right, as you know, so we try to synchronize activities so that we can use for both purposes.
Okay, that's great. So we've had one question in the chat from Preksha. Preksha, would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question, or would you like us to cover that? Are you happy to unmute and ask that particular point?
I can unmute myself. So just on a practical level, I'm curious, since programmatic style projects have multi-country interventions, and there is a lot more flexibility in the type of sub-project design, construction, specific activities, and they're sequenced through various phases. Is something like the LORTA kind of learnings and initial kind of lessons learned and closing that learning loop, is that more amenable to be sequenced or integrated into program style projects? Especially thinking of multi-country projects or more complex kind of project structures rather than a traditional single activity type of intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Preksha. It's a great question. I can kick off the response and see if we can get a discussion around it. And it's, in terms of the evaluation designs, it depends on the unit of randomization. So, for example, some of our evaluations would take the household, but others would take a particular community group. And you could also apply the same approach to sub-district or districts within a country. It may be the case that doing that across countries could be problematic, but then you could do the same type of design in a number of different countries if the intervention was going to be identical. It's not always the case with multi-country projects. Sometimes the intervention types can vary. But in terms of so far, many of the LORTA impact evaluation findings have been really at the micro level. And so this is, again, a challenge for us in terms of scaling up and paradigm shift, which we're going to come to very, very shortly. I'd just like to encourage other panel members to jump in on that particular point.
Maybe just to ask you a question. Maybe just to ask you a question. Have you done a LORTA evaluation of a multi-country GCF program yet?
So I'll hand over to Susumu, who's leading the LORTA portfolio, to respond. I don't want to answer this question. I think as you answered, but I think the issue or challenge of evaluating multi-country program is like the unit of intervention and also the data aspect, right? So the way how we do is, so far, in my understanding, is like we pick some country and to test that country and then try to scale up for other countries. Maybe I'm wrong. Yes.
Yes, I just actually wanted, I don't know if I understood Preksha's point well, but I just wanted to mention that PIXA, for example, was implemented not by GCF, but in many countries. And there was a qualitative assessment of that program. And in Malawi, we did the first quantitative rigorous impact evaluation. So I think we can say with some level of confidence that this training works. Can we?
Well, in terms of the PIXA, yes, because it's corroborated as well by a lot of qualitative information from the reports from other researchers. So our estimates or tally with those. But turning to Preksha's broader point about findings across countries, we did also work with the Development Bank of South Africa, DBSA, and we were designing an event study in terms of a particular set of interventions where they were installing particular solar renewables across for a particular corporate firm across the region. So it's a particular type of design and event study. It's basically pre and post, and that would have allowed some estimates to be generated across the Southern Africa region. Although due to extenuating circumstances, the design was never fully implemented. Just before we close, we've just got 2 or 3 minutes. I just want to really turn to Joseph and Gabrielle, just in terms of, how can we utilize these findings much better in terms of precipitating a paradigm shift in low emissions and climate development, climate resilient development pathways? How can we scale up? How can we lead to a paradigm shift? And how does LORTA findings, how do LORTA findings support that and offer a foundation for that? Gabrielle and Joseph.
If you allow it, I'll yield my time to Joseph, because I partially already answered the question earlier in terms of how we could use directly on an everyday level the results that you're producing. So over to you, Joseph.
Yeah, so thank you very much. I think this is a very, very important question. And first, we need to understand what paradigm shift is different for different contexts. And so I think that the lessons that we are learning really, really becomes important when we look at the baseline and where we want to get to in terms of where we need to focus attention. These evidence and legacies from other projects become very, very important. But then I also want to indicate that we could also be very rigorous in terms of how we do the assessment. I remember you did one assessment using system dynamics to look at the evolution in terms of space and time and map out areas that allows you to make some informed decisions or information within the policy space. I think this is one area that can help to inform some of the development of future programming by really adopting a systems approach that integrates all the elements and look at the causal relationship and the feedbacks, which will inform better development and outcomes, because the assumptions that we make are static. We don't know what happens as time passes, but using a systems approach will enable us to at least map out potential areas that could create conflicts. Thanks, over.
Thank you very much, Joseph. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of the panelists. So firstly, Dr. Anastasia Eladisheva, Susumu Yoshida, Gabrielle Bock, and Joseph Inceval for today's roundtable. And we'll just be closing in a minute or so. I'd also like to thank the participants here on the 12th floor for coming along, enjoying the coffee and donuts. We couldn't do these events without you, so we're grateful for your participation and interactions, and also all of you online who joined. I hope we'll also get further questions online in our future IU learning talks. And in the October talk for next month, we'll be focusing on the water sector and what works in both coastal and terrestrial water sector interventions to support the programming goals of the Green Climate Fund. I'd also like to hand a degree of thanks to our support colleagues within the Independent Evaluation Unit, who rarely get an airing within our learning talks. But we couldn't put these talks on without an incredible support team, including Jennifer, Karin, and Aiden for supporting us. So thank you all ever so much. And we look forward to meeting you all on the 12th floor next month for another IU learning talk to support the learning function within the Green Climate Fund. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael.